She was building her cabin, one log at a time, until the silent rancher came, asking, "Need a partner?" Willow Ridge, Montana Territory, late autumn, 1881. The wind blew cold over Willow Ridge, whistling through pine and sage like an old ghost. The sky was steel gray, low with snow, and the last of the golden aspens trembled in the distance, holding on as winter crept closer. Mary Carson stood in the clearing, dragging a log across frozen ground. Her gloves were torn, her palms raw, and her breath puffed white into the brittle air. Each movement came with a wince, but she did not stop. She couldn't afford to. She was building a cabin, alone, hammering, sawing, hauling timber twice her weight. Every part of it was hers. There were no neighbors nearby to help, no family left to call. Just her, a patch of land deeded by her late husband, and the quiet promise she had made to herself. She would finish this cabin before the first deep snow, or freeze trying. Above the ridge, a figure on horseback watched from the trees. Alan Walker shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. Every morning, for the past 2 weeks, he had ridden past this stretch of land on his way to the southern pasture. And every morning he had seen her, this woman, thin but stubborn, battling the land with nothing but will. He had told himself not to get involved. He had said it every time he saw her cut logs alone, every time she wiped blood from her hands with the back of her sleeve. He had whispered it to the wind, "Not your fight, Alan, let her be." But something about her would not let him turn away. He had buried his wife 2 years back. Margaret had died in a fever, along with the child she carried. And when they went, Alan had stopped speaking. He worked, he ate, he fed his horses, and he stayed silent. It was easier to keep the world distant than risk feeling anything again. Yet every day he saw Mary Carson. Something moved inside him, something old and painful, something like memory. Then one afternoon, Mary looked up. She paused mid-swing with the axe and tilted her head toward the trees. Alan froze. From that far, 200 yards maybe, their eyes met across the clearing. Hers were sharp, guarded, but not frightened. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she returned to her work, and Alan disappeared back into the pines. 3 days later, the storm came. It rolled over the mountains faster than anyone expected. By noon, the sky turned white with snow. Winds screamed through Willow Ridge. Mary fought against the gusts, trying to cover the cabin frame with canvas. Her fingers were numb. The tarp ripped in her hands. The nails would not hold. Panic was setting in. Then she heard hoofbeats. She grabbed her rifle, heart pounding. A shape emerged from the snow, tall, wrapped in a heavy coat, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. She raised the gun, ready to fire. But the man did not flinch. He dismounted, pulled a bundle from the saddle, and spoke quietly. "I am not selling kindness, just figured you could use a hand." Mary's grip tightened on the rifle. "I did not ask for help." "No, ma'am," he said, "but I am offering it anyway." He held up the bundle, canvas, nails, rope, and something wrapped in burlap that smelled like smoked meat. The storm roared around them. Her hands shook. She had no one, no backup, and no time. She lowered the rifle an inch, then another. "Fine," she said, "but keep your distance." "Fair enough." They worked in silence. Alan tied down the canvas with practiced knots. Mary hammered beside him, watching his movements from the corner of her eye. He moved like a man used to labor, efficient and quiet. No wasted steps. No chatter. Together, they reinforced the cabin's walls. Snow piled up fast, the cold bit deep. But the frame held. By nightfall, the storm had grown fierce, but the cabin stood stronger. Alan tied off the final tarp and stepped back. Snow clung to his coat, dusted his shoulders and hat. He looked at Mary once, nodded, and turned toward his horse. She called after him, "What is your name?" He paused. "Alan Walker." "Thank you, Mr. Walker." He tipped his hat, then disappeared into the storm. Mary stood alone in the cabin, wind howling through the half-built frame, but this time she did not feel quite so alone. And as she leaned against the newly secured wall, a strange warmth stirred in her chest, not from the fire, not from the food he left, but from the quiet way he had stepped into the storm to help her, expecting nothing in return. The snow fell thick and fast. But something had shifted. The cabin was not finished, but it had begun. Under the pale sky of the next morning, the storm having passed, snow still clung to the trees in thick white coats. Willow Ridge was quieter than usual, the world hushed beneath its frozen blanket. Mary stepped outside her cabin, now standing a little straighter, a little stronger after the blizzard. She inspected the canvas, tied down along the roof, the corners secured with Allen's knots. The place was still rough, but it had held. She thought he would not return, but by mid-morning hoofbeats echoed again from the ridge. She looked up. Allen was there, same coat, same horse, but this time he did not stop at the hill. He rode down. He did not ask. He simply tied off his horse, stepped onto the clearing, picked up a saw from her tool pile, and started cutting timber beside her. Mary said nothing. She did not need to. She handed him a wedge when he reached for one. He nodded, eyes flicking briefly to hers. They worked in rhythm, building without needing to name what they were doing. Walls rose. The roof frame took shape under their combined effort. She watched him move, deliberate, quiet, precise. He never wasted a gesture. He never looked tired. At dusk, Mary lit a small fire just outside the cabin. She roasted a strip of salt pork over the flame, 2 metal cups beside her filled with lukewarm coffee. Allen joined her without invitation, sat on the log opposite her, and removed his gloves. The fire crackled between them. Shadows danced across the snow-covered trees. They did not speak, but something passed between them as they ate, something heavier than silence, lighter than conversation. A look, a shared understanding. The next day, they lifted the first crossbeam into place. "Here," Allen said, his voice low, rough with disuse. "Weight needs to rest here, not on the edge." Mary nodded. "I see." He guided her hand to the right position, fingers brushing hers. For a moment, neither moved. Then both turned back to the beam. They worked until dark again, side by side. That Sunday, Mary rode into Timber Hollow for supplies. The church bell rang just as she arrived. She tied off her mule near the mercantile and walked up the wooden steps to the chapel. Inside, the air was heavy with whispering. People stared, not subtly. Clara Worthing leaned toward the banker's wife and said just loud enough, "She's building alone, and now a man is seen riding her way. A woman like that, no wonder her husband met trouble." Mary walked to the back pew. She felt each glance like a pin against her skin. Then the doors creaked open. Boots on wood. Allen Walker entered, hat in hand. A hush fell. He walked straight past the pews, toward the back, past every eye that turned to follow him, and stopped when he reached Mary. She looked up, surprised. He nodded to her. "Ma'am," he said, then took the seat beside her. Nothing more. But it was enough. Whispers turned to stunned silence. He had chosen. In front of them all. Mary folded her hands over her lap, heart thudding strangely. She did not smile, but her fingers, unconsciously, relaxed. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone. The days passed with quiet purpose. Snow melted and froze again. The wind never stopped whistling through the bare branches, but the air between Mary and Allen grew warmer, with each beam lifted, each nail struck. They had settled into a rhythm. Every morning, without announcement or knock, Allen arrived just as the sun rose. Mary would already be outside, sleeves rolled, breath fogging. He would tie his horse near the same pine, walk over, pick up the saw, and begin. No greetings were exchanged, none were needed. Their hands spoke for them. He passed her the hammer before she asked. She handed him the nails before he looked. When she lifted a beam too heavy, he was there, silently catching the other end. They worked side by side as if they had done it for years. Lunches were eaten in the half-shadow of the unfinished roof. Dinners often came by firelight, stew bubbling in the pot. Mary kept warm on the stone hearth, shared from the same tin bowl. One afternoon, cold but not bitter, they sat beside the fire, both with a cup of weak tea. The walls of the cabin stood tall now, the frame solid. It was beginning to look like a home. Mary stared into the flames, quiet. "My husband's name was Thomas," she said suddenly, voice low but steady. Alan did not look up, but his eyes shifted, his body stilled. "He worked land just east of here. Good man, hard man, hot-headed." She sipped the tea. "He argued over a fence line, got shot in the back." Silence. "They said it was his fault, that he started it, that I encouraged it." Her voice cracked slightly. "They called me a widow by her own doing, said I could not keep a man, said I wore shame like a scarf." Alan turned to her then. He did not speak, he simply listened. "I left. I took what little we had, what was left, this land, this cabin, and I told myself I would build something that could not be taken." She looked over, eyes meeting his. "Even if I had to bleed for every board." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "Margaret died in the spring." Mary did not interrupt. "She was 6 months along, caught the fever. I thought she would pull through." He shook his head. "By the time I rode for help it was too late." His fingers curled around his tin cup. "I never forgave myself." Mary's hand inched slightly across the dirt floor, not touching, just near. Her voice was softer now. "Sometimes we carry blame like a second skin." He looked at her, eyes unreadable, then nodded once. No more was said, no more was needed. That night, as darkness crept over the ridge, a storm moved in without warning. The cabin, though strong, still had gaps, windows without panes, doors without seals. Wind sliced through the unfinished walls, whistling like knives. Mary piled the fire high. Alan helped pull the tarp tight across the north side. But when the cold deepened and the flames flickered low, they both found themselves in the same corner, near the stone hearth, backs to the wind. The small fireplace gave little heat, but enough to keep the worst of the chill away. They sat close, their legs barely touching, a shared blanket draped across their shoulders, wool, scratchy and warm. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, it was silent. Mary's eyes fluttered shut for a moment. Her shoulder brushed his. He did not move. Minutes passed. The fire crackled low. Then, gently, Alan reached out. His hand, rough and calloused, found the top of hers, bare, small, resting on her lap. He did not grip, he did not squeeze, he simply touched. Mary opened her eyes, looked down. Then up at him. He was not watching her, he was staring into the fire. She did not pull away. Instead, she shifted just enough to let her shoulder rest more fully against his. Their bodies aligned, close but not entangled, and they sat that way for a long time, neither speaking, neither moving. The fire burned lower, but inside that small unfinished cabin, something else had begun to glow. Not heat, not desire, but a fragile, quiet trust, born from shared silence, strengthened by pain. A single touch, a single breath, a single understanding, they were no longer alone. The days became longer, though the sun still lingered low. Spring had not yet touched the valley, but the wind carried a different kind of cold, less biting, more watchful. Cabin walls now stood solid. The roof, though patchy, offered cover. Each morning, Alan still arrived as he always had. He tied his horse to the same pine, picked up his tools, and worked beside Mary without need for words. But something had changed. Mary felt it first in the way his steps hesitated on approach, then in the way his eyes no longer met hers when he handed her the hammer. He still worked hard, harder perhaps, but the quiet that once comforted now pressed heavy between them. One morning, she rose before the frost had melted from the grass. Alan was already outside, splitting logs. He did not look up as she approached. "You're not here," she said. He paused mid-swing, the axe held firm in his grip. "Your hands are," she continued, her voice tight. "But the rest of you, you left days ago." Alan set the axe down. He did not speak. Mary crossed her arms. The wind tugged at the loose braid over her shoulder. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Did I do something wrong?" He finally turned to her, eyes shadowed. "No." "Then what is it?" she asked. "Why do you look through me now? Why are you building these walls but pulling away?" Alan looked down at his hands, calloused, cracked, raw from weeks of lifting, hammering, pulling, hands that had once touched hers by the firelight without fear. "I do not know how to carry two ghosts," he said quietly. Mary blinked. "Two?" He nodded. "Margaret still lives here, in the corners of this place, in my chest." He pressed a hand flat to his ribs. "I thought I had buried her, but being near you, I feel her more, as if I have betrayed her by feeling something again." Mary stepped closer. The wind whipped around them, but she did not flinch. "You are not betraying her," she said. "You are surviving her." Alan looked at her now, really looked. Pain filled the lines of his face, years too old for a man his age. "I do not know if I deserve to move on." Mary's voice softened. "She died. That is not your fault. But if you keep dying with her, what was the point of your survival?" Alan's jaw tightened. His lips parted, then closed again. "She was good," he murmured. "Gentle. I was supposed to protect her." Mary reached out slowly. Her hand touched his sleeve. "You did what you could, and now you are here. So am I. We are both carrying cuts that will never fully close." He looked down at her hand on his arm. "She would want you to keep living," Mary said. "Not because she is gone, but because you are not." That was when it broke. Alan's shoulders trembled, his breath caught, and then, without a word, he sank to his knees in the frozen mud and buried his face in his hands. The silence cracked, not by words, but by the sound of a man finally letting go. Mary dropped beside him. She did not speak. She did not try to fix what could not be fixed. She simply wrapped her arms around him, held him, let the weight pass between them. There was no warmth in the wind, no gentleness in the dirt beneath their knees, but in that moment there was something stronger than comfort. There was understanding. Two people, neither whole, neither broken beyond repair. Two people who had stopped running. From the cabin, the fire inside glowed faintly through the gaps in the wood. And outside, in the cold morning light, Alan wept. For Margaret, for himself, for the future he had never dared imagine until now. Mary held him, head against his shoulder, eyes closed. Not to erase the past, but to make room for something after it. The town of Mill Hollow did not take kindly to deviation. By midweek, whispers had turned into full sentences, and full sentences into accusations. Mary's name was on everyone's tongue, at the general store, in the churchyard, over coffee and sermon notes. "She builds a house alone," one woman sneered, "but not without company." "She keeps strange hours with a widower," muttered another. "What decent woman does that?" "She lost her husband in a land fight. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" The rumors wrapped around Mary like smoke, choking every breath. She kept her head high, shoulders squared, but inside, she was drowning. Alan heard it too. Not directly, people knew better than to say such things to his face, but he saw the way they looked at him now. How conversation would hush when he entered a room. How the Reverend shook his hand a little too carefully after Sunday service. Still, he said nothing. Not when Clara Whitmore dropped passive jabs at Mary's forwardness, not when the sheriff asked, with a thin smile, if Alan was enjoying the benefits of being neighborly. And not when the town called a meeting. They held it under the guise of land boundary disputes and winter supply planning. But everyone knew why they were there. Mary stood in the back, quiet, alone. Alan sat near the front, back straight, hands folded, eyes hard. Clara stood and cleared her throat. "I believe it is time," she said sweetly, "that we address certain behaviors that may be bringing dishonor to our community." Murmurs of agreement rippled across the room. Some of us were raised with an understanding of modesty, of mourning, of knowing one's place. Alan felt the room tilt, like the earth had shifted beneath him. A man stood next. Vernon Sharp, local rancher. "I have nothing against folks finding comfort," he said, "but let's not pretend. He's on her land every day. They eat together, sleep," he smirked. "Buildin' a cabin's not the only thing happening at Willow Ridge." Laughter followed, ugly, sharp. Mary's face did not change, but her hands, by her sides, curled into fists. Someone turned to Alan. "Well, Mr. Walker," Vernon asked, "is it true?" The room went silent. Alan looked at them, at Mary, and fear clawed up his throat. "I help a neighbor," he said simply. No more, no less, no defense, no truth, no name spoken. Mary turned her head, just slightly, just enough to see him. Then she walked out. Her boots were loud against the floorboards, the only sound in the room as the door clicked shut behind her. Alan did not follow. He did not move. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, because silence had always been safer. Until now. Now, it had a price, and he had just paid it. Alan awoke to the letter in his hand before dawn. Snow whispered against windows. Mary's cabin lay in shadow beyond his fences. The summons weighed heavier than any winter gust. If she did not complete residence in 2 weeks, she would lose claim to the land. The law was cold and precise. Mary rose that morning determined. She wrapped her wounded shoulder where the timber had struck. She dragged herself out to the site, collected tools, stacked planks. But when she reached the final ridgepole, the last piece to close the roof, her strength faltered. Pain flared. Her breath hitched. The beam trembled in her grip. She dropped it. Her vision blurred. She sank to one knee, wind biting through her coat. The cabin stood nearly complete, but incomplete was no good under the law. She knew it. She had risked everything to see it built. Yet alone, injured, she could not finish it. At Walker Ranch, Alan sat hollow. He had kept distant, drank more than water these nights. The ghost of Margaret and their lost child haunted his silence. Moses, the old foreman, found him in the barn, bottle half empty. "He's trying to break you again," Moses said quietly. "That ghost, the guilt. Mary built a house from your absence. You going to let her lose it because you can't bear to speak?" Alan's hands trembled. "I don't know how to stand up. She deserves more than a broken man." Moses placed his hand on Alan's shoulder. "She's seeing you rise again by what you do, not by what you say. She made you wake up. Now don't slip back asleep." Later that day, Alan rode through dust and cold to the cemetery where Margaret lay under a marble cross. Snow dusted the stone. He dismounted, boots crunching. He knelt before her grave, voice hollow. "Margaret, Maggie," he paused, swallowing grief. "I died that day you went away. I said I would follow you. I thought that was loyalty. But it was cowardice." He touched the cold stone. "I stayed dead because I feared living. But Mary, she lights something in me I thought was forever lost. She asks me to live. She asks me to be more than a shadow." He closed his eyes. Tears melted in the snow. "I choose to live, to fight. Not for her land or her cabin, but for her. For what we might become. Please accept me again." He stood and rode. By late morning word had spread. Mary heard hoofbeats, distant at first, then more. A dozen men from town appeared at Willow Ridge. Moses, the blacksmith, ranch hands, even the preacher. They carried timber, ropes, saws. Mary stood with the half-finished cabin behind her, shoulder aching, eyes narrowed. Alan came last, snow lining his hair, silence in his step. He approached Mary. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for the silence, for letting you fight alone." Mary's jaw clenched, but her eyes softened. She nodded. He turned. To the men. "Help her finish." The men responded. Hammers rose. Voices filled the ridge. The cabin transformed in hours. Rafters aligned. Boards nailed. Final ridgepole lifted. Mary and Alan stood side by side as the last beam fell into place. The roof closed above them. Workers stepped back. The wind stilled. Mary's legs shook. She leaned into Alan. He put his arm around her. She didn't step away. They had passed the test, not by words but by resolve. The law's deadline came and went. No one challenged again. The cabin was complete. And Alan had chosen to live with her, for both of them. A pale morning sun rose over Willow Ridge, thawing frost into a milky light. The cabin, now nearly finished, stood as a testament to grit and faith. Mary stood on the front porch, her wounded shoulders stiff, wrapped in cloth. Alan stood just behind her, silent, steady. From the path below came footsteps and wagon creaks. Neighbors, small in number but strong in conviction, arrived with tools slung over shoulders. Hammers, saws, buckets, ropes. Moses led the group, followed by the blacksmith, a few ranch hands, even the preacher clutching nails in his pocket. Their faces were lined, their hands calloused, but they came smiling. Mary exhaled and nodded. The final rafters needed placement, the last siding needed nailing. Men spread out, 2 on ladders, others bracing beams. Mary passed boards, held lights, carried nails. Alan worked beside her, moving faster than any day before, strong in purpose. Every hammer ring echoed across the ridge. Every plank set stood as proof of solidarity. They worked until midday, then paused for bread and coffee shared by the fire in front of the cabin. Mary gave thanks quietly. Alan's eyes met hers as she offered him a mug. He nodded and drank. Then, in the quiet lull, a singular noise broke the moment. Hooves. Head turning, Mary watched Vernon Nash appear at the gate, riding with swagger and papers tied to his saddle horn. The hired men flanked him, rifles slung. He reined in at the edge of the crowd. The men paused, tools in hand, faces hardening. Vernon dismounted and slapped the papers on a plank fence. The wind caught the pages. He called out harshly, "I have legal claim. This structure is being built in presumption of title you do not hold. Work ceases at once." The crowd fell hush. Mary stepped forward, arm aching, her voice firm but controlled. "These papers prove my residence. I filed proper notice. I met legal requirements. This land is mine, and this is my home." The men around her shifted, glancing at each other. A few nodded. The blacksmith stepped closer to Alan. Moses placed a hand on Mary's back. Vernon's face reddened. "Nonsense. Your cabin was never complete when I filed suit. You tricked the law." The sheriff, arriving then, did not favor one side. He dismounted and approached the group. He carried no gun drawn, only authority in his stride. Mary froze. But the sheriff nodded toward her documents. "I have reviewed the claim. All paperwork is in order." Her occupancy began before the complaint. Her stove was lit, her tools in place, her presence continuous. The claim fails. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vernon spat. "This is not over." But he saw the sheriff's posture. He saw Alan standing tall beside Mary. He saw neighbors behind them. He knew his cause was lost. He mounted his horse, face twisted with rage, and rode away, leaving the dust to settle. The sheriff turned to Mary. "You have lawful right. No man may disturb you." Alan stepped to Mary's side. He did not shield or stand ahead. He stood beside. His presence was not a barrier, but a bond. The crowd breathed. Tools lifted again. By late afternoon, the cabin was finished. The rafters enclosed, the windows shuttered. Smoke curled from a modest chimney. It stood complete, no longer a work in progress. Men stepped back. The group dispersed slowly. Some stayed a moment to shake Mary's hand, to nod in respect. The preacher blessed the cabin in a soft voice. Mary turned to Alan. She did not speak. She leaned into him. He placed his arm around her. Inside, the fire lit, windows glowing with warm amber. Outside, the wind whispered against the logs. They entered their home together. No questions, no declarations. Alan stood in the back. Mary walked forward. She looked at each wall, each beam, each nail. Then she turned. He was there. She reached for his hand. He took it without hesitation. The warmth spread outward from the hearth. The night settled. The stars came. Their journey was not perfect. It was not easy. But it was theirs. A house built. A love defended. A beginning born from hardship, tenacity, and shared belief. And in that moment, Mary and Alan faced forward, not back, into the future they built. Spring breathed life into Willow Ridge. The snow melted into muddy paths dotted with crocuses and dainty green shoots. Birds returned, robins, sparrows, and the occasional flicker. The land smelled of damp earth and possibility. Mary stepped outside in the morning, arms bare against the pale sunshine. The cabin stood firm, its log walls warm in tone, windows framed and trimmed, curtains gently blowing in the breeze. A small garden lay before it, neat rows of potatoes and beans, a sapling planted for shade. Beyond, a new corral held Alan's horse, its stall built with care. They dressed early and rode together to church. Mary wore her best dress, simple but clean. Alan's hat was dusted, and his coat pressed. The townsfolk watched as they climbed the steps side by side. No whispers stopped when they passed. Some nodded, some tipped hats, some averted glances, but none spoke. Their respect grew in silence. Inside the wooden pew, Mary reached for Alan's hand. He squeezed it. He kept his voice low when the sermon ended. He did not shield her. He walked beside her as they exited. Their unity was a quiet defiance. That evening, after supper of stew and fresh bread, they sat on the porch. The sun dipped low, painting the pines orange. Their feet dangled over the edge, eyes tracing the horizon. Mary leaned into Alan, head resting on his shoulder, elbow brushing his arm, their fingers entwined. A soft wind passed. She inhaled. She whispered, "Are you afraid?" He turned his head and looked at her face. His eyes held scars and hope at once. He nodded. "I am," he said quietly. "But fear's like wood. You place one log at a time. Even the heart has its building approach." Mary turned to face him. Her hand left his for a moment, touched his cheek. "One log at a time," she murmured. Their breaths mingled in the spring air. No need for words, no need for promises, only presence. He leaned in. Their lips met gently. No rush, no hesitation, just the soft understanding of two souls scarred and rebuilt. She did not pull away. He did not fear closeness anymore. That night, inside the cabin, the fire burned bright in its stone hearth. Shadows danced on the walls, casting long memories and new hope across timber and board. Outside, stars claimed the sky, silent witnesses to the journey. Mary stood by the window, looking out at the ridge, at the forest that had once haunted her dreams. Alan moved behind her, draping his arms around her waist. She turned, rested her hands over his. Their foreheads touched. "Thank you," she whispered. He pressed his lips gently to her brow. "Thank you for staying." They stood there, no words more needed. In that cabin, warmed by fire and trust, the past's ghosts receded. The roar of the storms behind them, the path forward stretched in silent promise. A home was built, a love born of labor, silence, trials. No grand gestures, just steady choice. Outside, night deepened. The forest exhaled, the wind stilled. Inside, they settled together on a woven rug. The hearth glowed. The world beyond log walls fell away. And as the fire's warmth spread, Mary and Alan held one another. Their future lay before them, built from the kindling of trust, one log at a time. If that story warmed your heart like the fire in Mary and Alan's cabin, go ahead and hit that hype button to show some love. And if you want more tales of resilience, redemption, and real love blooming in the untamed Wild West, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. New stories every week, each one a journey worth taking. Until next time, keep building. One beam, one breath, one heartbeat at a time.